This is the first post-midterm session of the Sustainable Development course, and the discussion this week will begin to set the frame for the next several weeks, during which we will begin to consider the role of material consumption, economic growth, socio-technical transition, and human well-being as facets of sustainability. In many respects, the series of perspectives that we will take up will challenge in significant ways the notion of ecological modernization and related ideas that sustainability is best pursued through processes of engineering redesign and technological innovation. The first step in this process will entail unpacking the way that we customarily measure economic growth in contemporary society. I think for most people, it is not an especially insightful observation to remark that the pursuit of economic growth is a key, perhaps the most key, political imperative of the current era. It is virtually unimaginable to envision a reputable political figure making an impassioned plea for a curtailment in economic growth. There is an almost universal view that economic growth must forever march forward and upward, and that any concerns about sustainability must be fit around this objective. Accordingly, there has been a proliferation of interest in what is sometimes referred to as sustainable growth, focused on how we might be able to achieve modest improvements in energy and materials efficiencies without undermining the ultimate target of 2 to 3% annual increases in economic growth. Indeed, the foundations of sustainable development, dating back to the Brundtland Report, are premised on the contention that economic growth will, indeed should, continue for the foreseeable future and beyond, both in developed and developing countries. In mainstream society, and certainly among the mainstream media, there is a belief that indescribable disaster looms over the horizon should economic growth dip dramatically, and that public policy needs to be decidedly committed to ensuring that recessionary periods, defined as intervals when the overall size of the economy contracts, need to be kept as short as possible, and that we need to avoid economic and social peril at all costs. At the same time, we have come to view statistical measures of economic growth and the size of the overall economy as tantamount to quality of life, and this has profound implications for how we understand transition toward a sustainable future. We therefore begin this session with a brief review of the fundamental notion of economic growth that we touched on briefly several weeks ago, and that is so central to meaningful consideration of the concept of sustainability. As we discussed at the time, the rate of economic growth of the American economy over the past half-century, as displayed in the graph here, has been truly impressive, and it is a story of nearly continuous increase. In 2008, the size of the American economy was $14.2 trillion. Given all the attention that is devoted to the condition of the economy, whether it is increasing, whether it is decreasing, whether it is increasing fast enough, or perhaps too quickly, as in the case of a country like China, it is curious how little is generally understood about what the concept of economic growth actually entails. As defined here, economic growth is generally measured in terms of what economists refer to as gross domestic product, or GDP. In conceptual and statistical terms, GDP is similar to a roughly analogous measure called gross national product, or GNP. The differences do not need to concern us here, and in recent years, GDP has become the preferred alternative. GDP is defined as a basic measure of a country's overall economic performance. It is the market value of all final goods and services made within the borders of a country in a year. It is often positively correlated with the standard of living, though its use as a stand-in for measuring the standard of living has come under increasing criticism, as we will see, and many countries are actively exploring alternative measures to GDP for that purpose. In somewhat more technical terms, GDP is the sum of the amount of money spent by households and businesses on consumption, C, plus the amount of money spent on investment, plus the amount of money spent by the government, G, plus the difference between exports and imports. So if a national economy, say the United States, builds and sells more hammers at a fixed price this year than last year, GDP will increase, all other things equal. Keep in mind, though, that if the price of hammers declines for some reason, the contribution of hammers to GDP will go down, despite the fact that hammer factories are producing the same number of units this year than they did last year. In other words, GDP tells us very little about the volume of goods in the strict sense. It is a measure of the value of economic transactions that take place during a prescribed interval of time, usually 1 year. Flamethrowers and cigarettes are treated for purposes of GDP in exactly the same way as computers and libraries. GDP makes no distinction between what we might think of as good or bad products and services. I will have more to say about this general subject in a few moments. The histogram below, which we've seen before, shows the rate in annualized percentage terms of economic growth and contraction on a quarterly basis over the last few years. The years between 2006 and 2008 were marked by steady economic growth on the order of 2% each year. But this pattern shifted into negative terms in 2009, during which the national economy of the United States fell into recession. An economic recession is defined by 2 successive quarters of negative growth. GDP in per capita, or per person terms, has also been steadily increasing in recent decades, as displayed in the graph here. It is important, however, to recognize that this graph says nothing about how the proceeds of this growth have been distributed, a point that we will take up in more detail shortly. Suffice to say, for the time being, that this point generally falls below the public radar. Increases in per capita GDP are regarded as wholly positive, regardless of how it is ultimately put to use or distributed across the relevant number of people. It is just aggregate GDP divided by the total population. While GDP is normally assessed on a national basis, we can also measure it, what is termed gross world product, on a global basis. In these terms, the rising value of economic output over the past 100 years has been undeniably striking. The size of the international economy over this period of time has been on the order of tenfold and has been several orders of magnitude greater than the rate of population growth. There is no doubt a great deal of interest in economic circles and elsewhere about how countries around the world compare in terms of the size of their respective economies. The prevailing view is that if a nation's economy is not growing, or even worse, is shrinking, such circumstances are viewed as an indication of declining international stature. The presumption is that the only way to survive is to grow. In fact, that is the way the international system is constructed to a large degree. The total global economy was valued in 2007 at 54 trillion US dollars. The European Union accounted for approximately 30% of this total, and the United States was in second place overall with a further 25%. The American economy was 4 times as large as the Japanese economy and about 5 times the size of the German economy. All eyes, though, in recent years have been on the Chinese economy, which has been growing at 8 to 10% a year for much of the last decade. More updated figures indicate that China has already displaced Japan as the second largest economy in the world and is on track to surpass the United States by 2025. It's probably not necessary to dwell in much further detail about the extent to which our attentions are preoccupied by GDP. Suffice to say that there is nearly unwavering political consensus across the broad range of society in the importance, indeed the sanctity, of economic growth. There is obviously a powerful consensus across the business community that we must strive continuously to grow the economy. It is not only business interests that support the need for economic growth. Labor organizations, often characterized as adversaries of management, similarly and unquestionably endorse the relentless pursuit of economic growth under the premise that it is through such means that the interests of their members will be promoted. Government, of course, also embraces the perspective that economic growth is essential and important and undeniably necessary, because it is only by growing the economy that public treasuries are able to expand their revenues. This is especially the case during times like the present, when calls for increased taxes are regarded as political suicide. The point here is that there is a nearly universal and unwavering political consensus that economic growth is absolutely necessary. Taken a step further, government intervention through the formulation and imposition of regulations that might encourage environmental betterment, consumer protection, and a host of other public aspirations are regarded as drags on the economy and should be actively avoided out of concern that they can impede the rate of economic growth. This is without question the view that is presented by the mass media, nowhere more so than on the business news stations scattered across the cable television spectrum. I have posted to the course website a sample of this kind of programming. Even if you watch this sort of fare on an occasional basis, you will already be familiar with this brand of infotainment, and you can skip this video segment. Or you can just watch a portion of it to get a gist of this discussion. The amount of public attention that is devoted to GDP is truly remarkable, with an endless stream of banter about whether GDP is growing, how much it is growing, is it growing fast enough, and when will it stop growing? As a society, we have not had a hearty debate on the issue of economic growth since the 1970s. Since that time, the requirements of political pragmatism, as well as the need to be polite to avoid offending mainstream sensibilities, has squelched robust consideration of this topic. Nonetheless, over the past 2 years, there has been a definite and definable renewal of interest in some quarters in the whole issue of economic growth and its relationship to sustainability. It is that stream of thinking that we are going to take up here and in the next several sessions of this course. To give you a brief preview of how this discussion is going to unfold, I would like you to view the video segment entitled Hooked on Growth. This is the trailer of a film that is currently in production. To unpack things a little before we proceed, it is useful to distinguish between normative or judgmental or value-based questions and empirical or scientific questions about the extent to which a diminishment in the necessity of economic growth is an observable phenomenon. On the normative side of the ledger, it is worthwhile to pose the question of whether we have reached a point in societal evolution in which the costs of economic growth are now coming to exceed its benefits. We are accustomed to regarding economic growth as an unalloyed positive attribute, and in fact, the customary view is that more economic growth, the better. However, economic growth also imposes costs on society in terms of environmental degradation and societal fragmentation that arguably deserve more attention than they generally receive. The degree to which these costs outweigh the benefits is a matter of politics and ethics as opposed to scientific appraisal. In terms of empirical observation, there is value in considering questions that pertain to the degree to which advanced industrial societies like the United States may be moving to an evolutionary stage of their development where growth becomes less relevant and necessary in order to maintain societal cohesion. Indeed, this particular question is increasingly being asked about Japan, a country that has over the past decade experienced, at least by customary standards, relatively low levels of economic growth. The situation is frequently described as Japan's lost decade, and a major focus of international economic policy making has centered on how to inspire greater growth of the Japanese economy. But what if Japan represents an example of a forerunner country that is not somehow deviant because it has failed to achieve requisite rates of economic growth? What if Japan is an exemplar of the situation that other economically developed countries will find themselves in over the next several years? This question is increasingly being framed in terms of the emergent era of post-growth, where countries begin to transcend their ability and perhaps their need to achieve economic growth, at least as conventionally regarded, in regular 2 and 3% annual increments, and to start to adapt themselves to such conditions. This question, with the case of Japan firmly in mind, is increasingly being posed in Europe these days, as we will see. What I would like to focus on in this session is the perverse way in how we customarily measure and understand economic growth. Economic growth promotes either directly or indirectly the utilization of natural resources, or what we in this course have come to understand as the depletion of natural capital. Indeed, as we have discussed, there is currently growing concern that the consumptive demands of humanity in both developed and developing countries currently exceeds the carrying capacity of the planet, and that this appetite for resources is on track to grow quite substantially in the future in the absence of some rather significant changes. The conventional view is that we can offset this growing demand for natural capital by encouraging various efficiency improvements. However, as was described in the last session, these efficiency gains generate problems of their own. To review this important point, we can highlight a couple of further examples of this phenomenon here. Automotive fuel economy is regularly heralded as a critical requirement, and in countries like the United States, we too have pursued this option, at least for a time. Automotive fuel economy standards today are roughly twice what they were in the 1970s. Yet, overall, we use more gasoline for transportation purposes today than we did 3 decades ago. We observe the same situation with respect to electricity consumption. Despite strong emphasis, and indeed some rather commendable improvements in energy efficiency, electricity utilization from virtually all sources of production in the United States has continued to march steadily higher. This is especially the case in terms of electricity generated from coal, the largest generating source. Despite lots of public rhetoric to the contrary, the evidence over the past several decades is that economic growth encourages income inequality. In other words, the proceeds of economic growth accrue disproportionately in the hands of those households at the upper end of the income distribution. This is not an illusory phenomenon. It is in fact one of the most dramatic economic facts of recent history. As displayed in the graph here, income for the top 1/5 of the American population has increased by approximately 75% since the 1960s, while the gains for the bottom 1/5 have amounted to only about 25%. This situation, as we saw in an earlier session, is demonstrated in perhaps more dramatic form in the figure here, which shows the trend in income inequality in the United States over nearly 100 years. We tend to think about the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, as a period of pronounced income inequality, which indeed it was. However, the historic pattern, especially since the 1930s, became one of declining income inequality as indicated by the generally downward trend during the period. This pattern, as we discussed earlier, reversed during the 1970s, and aside from the years of the Clinton administration, income inequality in the United States has been trending ever higher. We are now at a point in time in which income inequality is higher than it has been in nearly a century. Viewed from a slightly different perspective, we have achieved pronounced economic growth over the last several decades, but especially recently, these gains have accrued on average mostly to wealthier households. It is notable to observe that the United States is not unique in this regard. Several economically advanced peer countries, like New Zealand, Finland, and Germany, have experienced similar increases in income inequality over the same time period. The evidence pertaining to the extent to which all of our economic growth has actually contributed to enhancements in individual and societal well-being is quite mixed. The graph here displays longitudinal data on several such indicators for the United States, calibrated in accordance with standardized baselines. While there has been modest improvement in economic well-being, the blue line, and community connectedness, the purple line, public concerns about safety, the tan line, have increased. The state of public health, the pink line, and perceived quality of social relations, the brown line, have declined. Educational attainment, the blue line, and emotional spiritual well-being, the blue-green line, are virtually unchanged. Again, there are some apparent contradictions here, especially between community connectedness and perceived quality of social relations, so we must take this overall picture with a grain of salt. Nonetheless, it would seem reasonable to conclude that economic growth has not produced the kinds of gains that we have been led to believe would occur. Finally, cross-national statistical analysis that compares the development, in this case as measured in terms of HDI, the Human Development Index, and National Ecological Footprint, a measure of the material intensity of corresponding countries, demonstrates that the most economically developed countries in the world, in terms of HDI, the group of yellow dots in the upper right-hand corner of this diagram, are dependent on the mobilization of very large volumes of energy and materials. More specifically, there appears on one hand to be a sharp inflection point where diminishing marginal returns begin to set in, and beyond which it requires the utilization of very considerable volumes of resources to achieve relatively small gains in HDI. On the other hand, the least developed countries have relatively low HDIs and correspondingly low levels of energy and materials utilization. The question then remains as to whether the middle range countries that have modest resource requirements and commendable HDIs, Mexico, South Korea, Japan, Italy, have something to teach the rest of us. I mentioned at the outset that there is a virtually complete consensus on the desirability of continuous economic growth. We have embraced a strict dogma that maligns and marginalizes anyone who has the temerity to suggest otherwise. One interesting case occurred a few months ago when former President Bill Clinton, perhaps one of the few people with sufficient stature to speak forthrightly in public about this subject, did just that. What is interesting is not just that Clinton did so, but the telling way that he was assaulted for professing such an apparently heretical point of view. Take a time out here to watch the video segment of this episode as it played out on Fox. Welcome back. So could we just be mistaken in our pervasive belief that economic growth is the universal solution to all ills? Could it be the case that at the core of a strong understanding of sustainability is this idea that economic growth causes more problems than it resolves? Could it be, as I said before, that we have become prisoners of our own dogma? All societies, especially in times of great ambiguity and insecurity like the present, display a tendency to grasp for what seem to be veritable certainties until they find out that these ostensible certainties are built on shaky foundations. Could we presently be in jeopardy of falling into this kind of intellectual trap. I am reminded of the quotation attributed to Warren Buffett, that things work until they don't. This being the likely case, is there not value in giving some forethought to this likely eventuality? In exploring this possibility, let us first begin by interrogating the way that we measure what we understand to be economic growth. The current procedure for compiling what economists refer to as the national accounts, the basis from which GDP is ultimately calculated, is characterized by numerous well-known flaws. These flaws are no secret, and mainstream economists are readily prepared to acknowledge the problems that they create. The standard orthodox response, however, is that there is no better way of assembling and processing these data. So we are best to get along as well as we can with what we have. This observation is not indeed correct, as we will see a little later. The first problem is that resource liquidation, the harvesting of natural capital, like forests and fisheries, is treated as income rather than the drawdown of an asset. The current system of national accounts confounds asset depreciation with income generation. The prevailing procedure is tantamount to a homeowner selling off his furniture and calling it income. Eventually, he has sold all of the furniture and finds himself living in an empty house. Another pernicious aspect of the way that we calculate GDP is that it regards adverse events, like natural disasters, as wholly positive. Earthquakes are treated as economically beneficial because infrastructure is destroyed and needs to be rebuilt. Workers are paid wages for doing so, and building materials need to be sourced. Personal lives may be dislocated. People may be seriously injured or even killed. But from the standpoint of national accounting, the devastation is singularly upbeat. In fact, the more disasters that occur, the better in the perverse logic of GDP. Third, in a related vein, environmental destruction caused by events like oil spills is economically beneficial. Back in the early 1990s, I was personally involved in a project to assess the economic impacts of the Exxon Valdez oil spill in South Central Alaska, which from an environmental perspective was unambiguously tragic. Hundreds of thousands of animals and birds were killed, and the pristine ecosystems of the region suffered enormously from the infusion of emulsified hydrocarbons. However, the accident had a discernible upward impact on national GDP during its aftermath due to the billions of dollars that were spent on the cleanup. Even increases in the incidence of chronic environmentally induced health conditions, like asthma, are regarded from a GDP perspective as advantageous because they generate demand for medical services and prescription drugs. Fourth, all variety of other events that most of us would view as singularly disadvantageous or harmful are regarded in positive terms. Car accidents, for instance, are great from the perspective of national accounting. Totaled cars need to be replaced, and that generates purchases that add to economic growth. There is a whole host of other people who derive income from the accident, from tow truck drivers to metal workers. If someone is injured, all the better, because now there are doctors and nurses and X-ray technicians that have work that they otherwise might not. Lawyers are also likely to get involved, adding further to GDP. The point here is not that current methods for calculating GDP actively encourage people to get in automobile accidents, but rather that events that most of us would regard as diminishing well-being are, from an economic standpoint, treated as positive, so we end up with a skewed and perhaps even misguided understanding of our quality of life. Fifth, likewise, crime is economically beneficial. When someone breaks into your car and steals your CD player, you are, if you are like most people, compelled to go out to purchase a new one. Ironically, the more crime and vandalism that a society experiences, the more replacement and repair is required, and hence the GDP goes up. Sixth, even the imprisonment of convicted criminals provides an economic lift. Prisons need to be built, wardens and guards hired to run the facilities. It makes no difference whether they are publicly or, as in some case states, privately operated prisons. It all makes a positive contribution to GDP. As can be seen from the figure here, there has been large-scale proliferation of prisons in the United States. Indeed, this country has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The end result is that we have criminalization of a large portion of the American population, yet it is all good from the perspective of GDP, because this population requires buildings, security, meals, and a vast array of other material goods and services. Seventh, the economic benefits of war are likely well understood. Indeed, it is widely recognized that it was not so much the New Deal programs of the 1930s that pulled the United States out of the Great Depression, as much as it was eventual American engagement in World War II. Wars create demand for huge volumes of military equipment and supplies. Paradoxically, the more equipment, supplies, and so forth that are destroyed by enemy combatants, the better it is in terms of promoting economic growth. Finally, and perhaps most problematically, our customary means of national accounting ignores activities that are not part of monetized transactions. It is only goods and services that are bought and sold with money, either cash or credit, that count from the standpoint of GDP. So, for example, a parent playing with his or her child is ignored and ultimately undervalued by public policy makers because such an activity does not register in the annual GDP calculations. Similarly, caring for an elderly relative does not show up on the national accounts. This is not a trivial problem, because if the ultimate aim of politics is to grow the size of the economy, these kinds of invisible activities will fall by the wayside within the context of national economic planning. If you buy a ticket to go to a basketball game, that is good for the economy. If you stay home to play a pickup game, that is irrelevant from the standpoint of GDP. As a result, we formulate policies that tacitly encourage paid spectatorship over individual participation. Cut your hair yourself or have a friend do it for free, and there is no economic benefit to the nation at large. However, if you go to a commercial salon to have it done, forking over, say, $100 for the service, there is a positive contribution made in terms of GDP. Finally, the most famous rendition of this phenomenon is told in terms of the somewhat flip example of how the overall size of the economy shrinks when a man marries his maid. The housekeeping services he previously paid for, he now gets for free. This particular example always gets me into trouble, so for purposes of gender equity, I'll also relate it in the reverse direction. So a woman who marries her automobile mechanic does similar damage to the economy, because rather than paying to have an oil change, her husband now does it for free. In conclusion, then, a growing number of people have been calling for an end to the use of GDP, or at least to supplement it with another metric. It is problematic for the reasons we have outlined as a measure of economic standing, and it is even less adequate as a measure of societal well-being. One of the correctives developed as a replacement for GDP is something called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, or ISEW. This is a measure that was initially formulated by the ecological economist Herman Daly and several colleagues, and has over the past 2 decades come to attract a growing number of adherents. The ISEW aims to correct, as effectively as possible, many of the flaws that I have just described. In other words, expenditures associated with crime and imprisonment are treated as societal costs rather than as societal benefits. Aggregate GDP is similarly adjusted to account for pollution, environmental degradation, and resource extraction. When these corrections are implemented, what we typically find, as displayed generically in the graph here, is that rather than a pattern of more or less continuous upward movement, as is the case for GDP, a more honest and realistic means of assessing economic and societal welfare reveals a downward trend. Several countries, both in official and unofficial capacities, have begun to calculate ISEW on an annual basis, and the results are intriguing and support the impressions of many sustainability scientists. Here is the example of Germany. German GDP, the red line in the graph, has steadily increased over the last several decades, as we know to have been the case. However, ISEW for the country began to deviate rather sharply, beginning in the early 1980s, though it has begun to recover and to more closely track GDP in recent years. In the example here of Austria, GDP and ISEW tracked one another quite closely until the 1970s, and then began to deviate without any recovery apparent. In other words, the standard appraisal is that quality of life, as generally regarded in terms of GDP, has been increasing in Austria. But when the social and economic costs of growth are factored into the equation, a very different outcome becomes visible, namely that well-being has been stagnant in the country for the past nearly 30 years. The UK shows an even more dramatic disparity between the two measures. After tracking quite closely during the 25 years after World War II, ISEW in the country was even higher than GDP during the 1970s. But since the early 1980s, a wide chasm has opened up, and the more comprehensive measure of ISEW conveys a picture of sharp divergence between the official message of well-being as conveyed by GDP and the unofficial message conveyed by ISEW. Another alternative measure of economic and societal well-being that is roughly similar to ISEW is called the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. This is the index that is described in great detail in the reading by Clifford Cobb and his colleagues that I assigned for this week. Calculations of GPI for most developed countries generate results that closely approximate the situation that we saw for Germany, Austria, and the UK. The standard assessment of well-being is an account of steadily increasing GDP, and this is generally interpreted as an upward improvement in the standard of living. The GPI, like the ISEW, however, offers a different picture, one where the costs of economic growth have been for some time now swamping the benefits. GPI for the United States provides what should be now a familiar story. The last 5 or 6 decades have been marked by more or less steady upward increase in GDP, and there has been a widespread tendency to interpret this phenomenon as an indication of growing material affluence and improvement in the American standard of living. As we have discussed in considerable detail, this means of measurement, however, is fraught with numerous conceptual and mathematical problems. When we make a more honest accounting of the past half-century using GPI as our index, we glean a very different picture of this period, one where the costs of economic growth have for some time now been overwhelming the benefits, and that this cleavage between the official message conveyed by government and others is at variance with the more realistic conditions that ordinary people face on the ground. Anecdotal evidence also suggests that the latter measure corresponds much more closely with the intuitions of many people who have the benefit of personal hindsight over this stretch of time. It also helps to explain the confusion that people frequently encounter when they continuously hear statements in the media about an ever upward escalator in the American standard of living, and that these reports do not accord with their own experiences. A final point I would like to make before we conclude this session is to highlight a related area of research that has been the focus of a great deal of attention over the last few years. Interestingly, economists, psychologists, and others have taken a great deal of interest as of late in the whole notion of happiness, how to evaluate it, and how to assess it. This area of activity is referred to in more formal terms as the study of subjective well-being, and the tools for making these appraisals are becoming increasingly refined. One way of approaching this set of issues is to look at the correlation between GDP and national survey results on the percentage of the public that deems itself to be happy with life as a whole. Some very interesting results emerge and cast further doubt on the whole notion of equating economic output with national well-being, as we are presently wont to do. Countries cluster into 4 broad categories. In the upper right-hand cluster, we find the most economically advanced countries in the world. Countries like the United States, Canada, and Sweden. These are nations that have high per capita incomes and relatively content publics. The second group is comprised of a diverse array of middle-income countries, like the Czech Republic and Slovakia, that report modest levels of happiness. Third, the Latin American countries also have modest incomes, but relatively high levels of happiness that in some cases, most notably Mexico and Brazil, are nearly comparable to the levels that exist in the most affluent countries. Finally, we have the community of African nations that have levels of per capita GDP and comparatively low levels of happiness that pose a whole host of issues that we will set aside for the time being. While we need to be careful about interpreting this kind of figure, there exist, after all, important cross-national differences in how happiness is experienced and expressed. But there seem to be some useful observations that we could make. In the first instance, there appears to be a pattern of declining marginal gains in happiness. At the higher levels of income, it takes a substantial increment of additional income to generate a notable improvement in happiness. Based on the curve that is fit to the scatter plot, this pattern of declining marginal improvement seems to set in at about 10,000 US dollars. In other words, each additional, say $1,000 in per capita GDP, generates a sizable boost in happiness, but this effect declines as one passes the $10,000 threshold. Second, the most affluent countries seem to be relatively inefficient in converting income into happiness, and there are perhaps some important lessons that we might derive from the experiences of the middle-income Latin American countries that require far fewer material inputs to achieve relatively high levels of happiness. I'd like to end this session by asking you to view 4 video clips that help to summarize what we have discussed here, while at the same time offering glimpses of where we will be headed over the next few weeks. The first of the video clips is a short segment featuring an encore performance by Bill McDonough. The key part of this clip is the question that McDonough poses. He says that for him, the question is not growth versus no growth, but rather, what do we want to grow? This is an important observation and speaks to the lack of a critical perspective in much of our public debate today, where we embrace the notion of growth without having even a faint clue about what it is that we want to grow. Public policy in the United States and in many other countries today is driven by a growth for growth's sake sort of mentality. The second video clip is an educational segment produced as part of a European Union project called Beyond GDP, and the sponsorship provides an indication of how high on the policy agenda this general set of issues has begun to rise. The third clip features Bill McKibben, a prominent public figure in the world of American environmentalism and green thinking more generally. McKibben recently wrote a book called Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities and the Durable Future, and he discusses some of its content in this recorded presentation. The last video clip for this session, that's posted to the course website, is an interview conducted with Canadian ecological economist Bill Rees, one of the developers, along with Matthias Wackernagel, of ecological footprinting analysis. Rees is another key figure in the current debate on redefining and re-envisioning what we mean by economic growth. Once you have viewed these 4 segments, you will have reached the end of this session.